Welcome to Model Railroad Switching Operations Part 3 here at my Stevens, New Mexico BNSF Model Railroad layout. At the end of Part 2, we had set aside some cars on two different tracks that will be forwarded, both some to the east and some to the west. And today we're going to have some through freights come through to pick up those cars. Here you see my staging yard, and this is basically a place where trains that originate and head to locations off the layout spend time while they're waiting to make an appearance. On the left side represents La Junta, Colorado and points to the west, and the right side is Albuquerque, New Mexico and points that are off to the east. Also residing in the staging yard, you see our intermodal container train ready to leap into action in La Junta, and there on the Albuquerque side we see the Southwest Chief Amtrak passenger train ready to go and make an appearance. But we're going to start out in La Junta there on track 3, and actually I think track 2 as well. Some of the train resides. We're going to go ahead and pick up our BNSF locomotive number 617 and put that to work. It is a Dash 9 locomotive from General Electric. We'll go ahead and get that coupled onto our train. The staging yard or fiddle yard, not being part of the formal layout, doesn't necessarily have any scenery on it. It's just kind of utilitarian, a place to get your trains ready to make an appearance or to put them back to rights after they're finished with their day's work on the layout. We'll go ahead and pull that locomotive forward to clear the switches. We've got cuts of cars on both track 2 and track 3 that will make up our train that is heading from La Junta to points west out to Barstow, California and Los Angeles. You know, when you get a 8-foot long piece of plywood, you think you can fit an awfully large yard onto it, but by the time you use the number 6 turnouts and build a compound ladder, some of your tracks can only end up holding 4 or 5 cars, and that's just the way it is. You do have to stick with some curvatures that allow reliable operation of the fleet and so on. So we'll pick up that last set of cars off of track number 3. You'll notice up by the locomotive a green signal on that signal indication there. That indicates that the turnout up ahead is lined to get this train out onto the main line. The cars up in front are through cars. They will not be stopping in Stevens, but the last 3 cars that you see there are going to be dropped off at Stevens, New Mexico, and tomorrow they will end up being switched out to local industries. And here comes our through freight train, making kind of a gratuitous pass by the Amtrak station just so everybody can get a good look at it. I've got some cars on there that may or may not appear out on Western railroads such as the BNSF in New Mexico. Certainly not the Green Bay and Western, but I do like having that car on the layout. We've also got we've got a Wisconsin Central hopper there, a Milwaukee Road that doesn't exist. There's the Green Bay and Western, another Wisconsin Central. So we like to get some of those Wisconsin pieces of equipment in the scenery. And here comes the through freight train. Fortunately, they're slowing down. It's within yard limits now. And for this particular train, we're going to take care of the switching operation in a rather simple way. The through freight train is going to proceed past the yard lead and simply going to back into the yard on an empty track, drop off that Burlington Northern gondola with some scrap metal. The Railbox boxcar and the NS hopper are all going to be left there on track number 2, and pick up 3 outbound cars from track number 3. Just a matter of interest, I could have left those cars further up the siding and dropped them off a lot faster, but In the real world, you would probably push those cars all the way down to about the same spot where the cars to be picked up are. That way, who's ever uncoupling the cars and then coupling the other cars onto the train from the other track simply have to walk from one track to the other rather than walking like a long distance through the yard. So we'll simply back up our through freight train down track 3. Oh, there's our Green Bay and Western boxcar. And couple on, and we've got a clear signal to depart the yard from the yard lead and head on out of town, heading off to points west. Here's another good look at our train passing the Amtrak station. And we see as our train heads out of town, there is an excursion train, a former Union Pacific locomotive, an E9 passenger locomotive with 6 cars, including a baggage dormitory and a couple dome cars, passing through town as our through freight train departs the area. That train will be heading off to Barstow, California, and then Los Angeles. Now back at the staging yard, we're going to pick a different BNSF locomotive. This one is a more recent Tier 4 compliant model. Technically, it may not be appropriate to my layout, which is really set in the 1990s, as that's more of a early 2000s model, but it was on sale at one point, and I liked the look of it, so I went ahead and acquired it. And we'll go ahead and latch on to our train that is currently in Albuquerque and is heading east to Stevens and then on to Kansas City and Chicago. And as with the other train, the first several cars on it are through cars and are not being left in Stevens, but I think the last 3 cars are going to be dropped off, and the 3 other eastbound cars that are in the yard will be picked up. So off we go. And as with any layout that's not quite massive, the distances on the actual layout aren't that far apart. So a lot of times a freight train like this, we'll go ahead and run it around the whole layout rather than take it right into the yard. It adds a little bit of interest. Now with this particular train, we're going to go ahead and do something a little bit different. Instead of having this freight train back into the yard, drop off its cars, and pick up the outbounds, we're going to have it sit out on the main line and cut off its cars that it's dropping behind out there, and then have the cars they're picking up pushed out onto the main line to couple to it. Now, there could be a couple reasons for that. It could be that on the particular railroad, it could be the rules of the yard, that the through freight trains and crews can't work in the yard, that has to be done by yard crews with a yard locomotive. Or, in fact, it could actually be a time-saving kind of thing. Now, in my case today, for this particular video, I'm doing it because it adds operational interest, and among other things, it points out what I would call an escape track in the freight yard. You see there, right next to the yellow rail boxcar, you see a crossover from track 1 to track 2, and we're going to use that here because our GP38 up at the head end there is basically, it's at the head end of that cut of 3 cars and is in no position to push those cars out onto the main when the through freight arrives. But it's going to drop that cut of 3 cars there, pull forward to clear the switch. We'll back up down track number 2 and then take that crossover to get behind those cars. Then it's in a position to push those cars out onto the main line to couple onto the through freight. And I don't often get to use my escape track there, as I call it, so it's kind of nice to use it. The other purpose for that escape track is the locomotive can pull cars into the yard rather than back them in, but it can pull in on that track, cut the cars off before the switch, and then escape, thus the name that I've given it. So now it's crept up behind that cut of cars, and we'll go ahead and push those cars out onto the yard lead and get ready for that through freight train that is approaching, and it'll be ready to push them out and get them onto the back end of that train. One thing you notice here is the difference between a well-ballasted main line and the kind of dirty and grubby looking tracks within a yard which aren't as well ballasted and aren't suitable for high speeds and such. So here comes our eastbound freight train heading up to the yard lead, and it's going to pull right up there. In the foreground there you see an old caboose sitting there on display at the Amtrak station for the passengers to check out while they're waiting for their train. So the conductor, probably from the yard, has gone out and decoupled there. The through freight moves forward, decoupling the 3 cars to be dropped off, and after allowing a suitable distance, now the yard locomotive pushes the 3 cars that are to be picked up out onto the main, and we'll get them coupled onto the rear end of that eastbound freight, creeping along nice and slowly, as should be done. And boy, there it is, hooked on. Now our yard locomotive backs up and grabs onto the cut of cars being dropped off, and that through freight train is heading on its way, perhaps a little bit faster than if it had to back into the yard and do that work. Off it goes, heading off to Kansas City and Chicago. And our yard locomotive, our trusty GP38, now has the 3 cars dropped off well in hand. We'll pull forward to clear the switch to the yard lead, and we'll go ahead and back those cars into the yard. It will then join the 3 cars previously dropped off by the westbound freight train, and those cars will then be ready to be switched out to industries with tomorrow's work out of the Stevens yard. We'll back up and hook on there. So that cut of cars will now be ready for the local job tomorrow, and our GP30 will go ahead and cut away and park for the night, and it will be ready for work tomorrow. Thanks for watching the video. I hope some folks watch the whole thing and listen to my wonderful commentary.